Hello, everyone. Welcome to Half-Cooked Ideas, a series of talks about thoughts you are unlikely to hear elsewhere. They will take you through the genesis of the Betweenness Model. It also contains an explanation for the origins of doubt and uncertainty, and it will introduce you to the language and convention, tampering, and meddling effects. Don't worry if you don't understand what I'm talking about. They will be explained in other talks. Enjoy, and I hope my philosophy is of value. So let's check where we stand. We finished the first segment, which is the introductory segment. The following talk falls under the second segment, which is a collection of random arguments and precursor thoughts that eventually led to development of the core fundamentals of cognition and the Betweenness model. After we finish this segment, we'll move to the formal argument segments about the core fundamentals of cognition and about the Betweenness model. This talk is titled Being There, and it relates to all life's processes, but in particular, I'm interested in the mental and cognitive processes. I wrote here a process membership often systematically neglects the non-member, and this plagues all processes, including cognitive processes. It's not enough to exist. Things have to be available to be processed, and that has consequences, as you can see in the following slides. Okay, so let's take an example. Mentation, including devising definitions, often systematically neglects the non-mental. Let's be a little bit more specific. The definition of knowledge overlooked non-mental knowledge, which is understandable because non-mental processes are not available to the mental process, which decided to define knowledge in mental terms. Let's try to explain this. This is a little bit convoluted. DNA is not part of the brain and was not included in the definition of knowledge because the processes that devised the definition of knowledge were blinded to it. Therefore, they defined knowledge in mental terms. DNA clearly conveys know-how from one generation to the other generation. Ask your hand why it has 5 fingers. That the mind did not decide this. Same thing can be said about histones. The way we package DNA conveys information outside DNA and outside the mind from one generation to the other generation. Let's try to explain it in a different way. The most widely accepted definition of knowledge is justified true belief. Belief is a quality of the mind. Histones and DNA are not about believing or disbelieving. This quality excludes these from the membership of knowledge. The mind, of course, is a mental process and defined knowledge in mental terms, excluding these things as knowledge carriers. Of course, you can say they don't carry knowledge because the definition says so. However, if we look at the purpose of knowledge, you can propose multiple purposes. Let's look at this proposed purpose. The point of knowledge is to guide actions. Again, those are not my words. These are the words of Socrates. He basically said knowledge guides actions. Let's look at DNA and histones. DNA tells you to develop your nose in the center of your face. The brain did not do that. It doesn't matter if you believe or disbelieve that the nose should be there. That's where it's going to be. The same thing can be said about histones. It has nothing to do with believing or disbelieving. It carries information from one generation to the other generation by packing DNA in a certain way. And this know-how that passes from one generation to the other generation and affects everything in your life is not counted as knowledge because of the prejudice of the definition, despite that they actually qualify as guiding actions, which is the purpose of knowledge, as stated by Socrates. I know it's convoluted. Hopefully I made it easy enough to understand. Another quick example, perception often systematically neglect or cause you to neglect the imperceptible. I think that's self-explanatory. You're more likely to see things that fall within the visible range of light compared to infrared and ultraviolet, and I'll leave it there without further explanation. Okay, so we're getting closer to the punchline, or at least one of the punchlines. Let's try to explain consequences of this line of reasoning. To react is to notice. If you don't notice something, you're not going to react to it. So we can say that unnoticeables do not elicit reactions. Passing judgment is a reaction, and this is important because passing judgment is an essential part of knowledge gaining. Assigning knowledge, progress in knowledge is all based on judgment. So all judgments are blind to unnoticeables, and therefore unnoticeables are unrepresented in any judgment process, including knowledge. Representation can be said universally to always possibly being wider because notoriety has limits. Let's try to look at it differently. To react is to notice. You're not going to react to something that you don't notice. Being noticeable can be followed by judgment. If you're not noticeable, you're not going to be represented in the judgment process. And this is our punchline. Because of our inability to have full representation, all judgments are prepared from a prejudice sample, which undermines the certainty in judgment. Okay, so the main point of the talk has already been made. Again, in summary, being noticeable is one thing, which is how our knowledge is very dependent on, but existing, being factual, being important, being relevant is not the same thing. Some things are factual, reality-based, useful, important, but since they are not noticed, they don't get incorporated in the knowledge gaining process and in our reactions. This slide is about giving further examples, although the main points have already been explained. We can divide unnoticeability into two types, into things that we're born with, and man-made unnoticeability that we do to ourselves. So the wagon wheel effect is something related to our inability to sample visual surroundings more than 60 frames per second. Our eyes are incapable of sampling more than 60 frames per second, and that has consequences. This wheel that we're going to run the video soon, this wheel is moving clockwise, but at certain speeds these lines are going to appear non-factually in a way that doesn't represent reality, moving counterclockwise. And the reason is your eyes are not able to notice all the steps that the black line moves through. At certain speeds it's going to miss the line over here, miss it over here, miss it over here, miss it over here, miss it over here. And then when your eye gets ready to actually take the next sample, the black line already moved this distance. So it's understandable for the brain when it reconstructs what it's seeing to imagine, it's easier to imagine that this line moved backward instead of this line moving all the way here without it noticing it. So this is a consequence of not having full representation or availability of knowledge. Let's run the clip. Okay, so we're following here, but at some stage these lines are going to go backward. You can start to see it going backward. It's much clearer now. And I'm going to stop the clip. Okay, so let's take a few man-made, manufactured reasons for unnoticeability. One of my favorite examples is the language tampering effect and convention meddling effect, which will be explained later in more details. Basically, using language, any language, including zeros and ones, spoken language, the language of mathematics, geometry, which are basically conventions also, causes a situation where you are more likely to notice a few aspects that are incorporated in your judgment and are also gonna lead to you not noticing things and not incorporating things that you should be incorporating in your judgment process. And we decided that passing judgment is a reaction that is essential in knowledge. So language and convention affects our knowledge, and it's inescapable. Another example of something that can cause unnoticeability is the designation or agreement on a frame of reference. Don't for a minute think that there are undesirable consequences to taking, for example, the ether, which is preceded Newton as a frame of reference. That had consequences. The same thing can be said about the frame of reference that Einstein used. We basically, to my understanding, used the observer as the frame of reference. Don't for a minute or a second think that there are no undesirable consequences to accepting that frame of reference. That frame of reference will improve the noticeability of a few things that ought to not receive that notoriety, and it's also gonna diminish noticeability of other things that ought to be more noticeable, and that has consequences on our understanding of reality. Okay, we're almost finished. This is the relevance segment. I think I already mentioned how profoundly relevant the being there problem is, but to reemphasize, it is a fundamental flaw in the methodology of knowledge. It doesn't matter what the knowledge source is. It cannot escape the being there problem, which basically means that all of these have limitations. So don't accept blindly that, for example, mathematics is the language of the universe. It's not. The universe is reality. Mathematics cannot represent reality completely, so take it with a grain of salt. So how is this related to the first law of cognition? Again, the first law of cognition affirms the indirectness of truth and knowledge. They're very interrelated, and as a matter of fact, if you accept the being there problem, then that is confirmation of the first law of cognition. So if the first law of cognition was not true, you had direct access to truth and knowledge, then you wouldn't need to sample. You already have knowledge and truth. You wouldn't need representation. You wouldn't need to pass judgment. You wouldn't need to react to something, whether it's knowledgeable, truthful, or otherwise. So the being there problem is not possible if this was not true. Now let's see how it's related to the second law of cognition. Let's remind ourselves of the second law of cognition. It's related to terms and conventions being always present in any mental activity or any process throughout life, and also that these terms and conventions don't come without a price. You cannot have any term or any convention without limitation of freedom. You must lose some freedom in your movement or your mental process or your ability with any term or convention. Otherwise, it's not a term or convention. So if you establish, maintain any term, you sacrifice freedom. And that loss of freedom impairs your ability, whether you perceive it or not, in sampling reality. And when you have less representation of reality, it brings up the being there problem. Being there might be due to something being term friendly. If something is term unfriendly, it might not be there for you to notice, and therefore might not be incorporated in the knowledge process, and that's not escapable. Anything that has terms, even mathematics, even physics, there will be a being there problem where something in reality is not term friendly and therefore would not receive the attention that it ought to. So all judgments, including mathematical, physical judgments, experimental judgments, are prepared from a prejudice sample. That's the being there problem, and that's one of the consequences of the second law of cognition that is inescapable and plagues our human existence. This concludes our talk. Thank you for watching. If you found this interesting, please join us on other talks. And if you think this is valuable, please share with others. Bye-bye. See you later.